think on Friday we were supposed to talk a bit about puja, so I'm going to make a few remarks about that. And you may remember that in the earlier Vedic period, the main religious process, the main process for human beings to contact higher powers and so on, was called yajna, your yajna sacrifice. And if you look at the Vedic hymns, such as the Rig Veda, the hymns are generally all addressed to different gods and goddesses who are not directly seen, you could say, in the process of sacrifice. What you do see is the fire, which represents Agni, or is Agni, the god of fire. There are many stories in the Puranas where the gods or goddesses who are being worshipped in the fire sacrifice actually appear. They just show up in the middle of the fire sacrifice because they're being invoked. And so being invoked, they appear, and human beings in higher consciousness can actually see them and talk to them and so on. So that's a common scenario. Now, according to the Vedic point of view, as opposed to, say, modern scholarship, because sacrifices went on in previous ages when people were in higher consciousness, in this age, Kali Yuga, which is a fallen age, people no longer can directly see and talk to the gods. And therefore, you could say, to make things more explicit and easier to understand, the tradition starts developing actual physical forms of the gods and goddesses, or even of the Supreme God, so that people actually in their worship, instead of simply offering oblations into a fire, a physical fire, and through higher consciousness seeing gods and goddesses, now they actually see the gods and goddesses in figures made out of carved from wood or marble or cast in different metals, and the deities are actually there on the altar. Interestingly, in the Old Testament, if you know your Old Testament, in the early part of that history, God often appears to human beings like Adam or Eve or Abraham or Isaac. So God talks to human beings, sometimes appears to them, just like the descriptions in the earlier Vedas. But at a certain point in the Bible, that no longer happens. And what develops is the Old Testament prophetic tradition, where there are certain prophets, certain human beings supposed to be in higher consciousness, who do directly hear from God. In a sense, they channel God. And then these prophets, to use the typical phrase, speak truth to power. They go before kings and speak the truth. They tell the truth to the people, like, you've forgotten the will of God, you're not behaving in a way that's pleasing to God, and so if you don't correct, if you don't mend your ways, God is going to do something really bad to you. And so that's a typical, but again, there's a shift from God directly speaking to people to God speaking through prophets, and even that at a certain point seems to wane, and you get into simply like studying scriptures like Talmud and so on. But anyway, so this process where you worship physical gods and goddesses, this is a feature not only of India, but was also extremely common in Europe. It's extremely common in Europe, and in fact throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, Paul of Tarsus, not exactly what you call an ecumenical guy. As Paul of Tarsus was traveling throughout the Roman Empire, he often preached against these visible forms of gods and goddesses, and he accused the people of worshiping dead gods, engaging in idol worship, and so on and so forth. Now in India, India was never taken over religiously or culturally by a Middle Eastern tradition. And so they never rejected the worship of visible forms. It's interesting that even in the Old Testament, after the first great temple was built in Jerusalem, there was a real problem for the iconoclast, those who were against these visible forms, because even in the old temple of Jerusalem, the Jewish people kept bringing in these little idols. And periodically the prophets come and preach against it, and maybe for a generation they'll take the idols out, but then they'll bring them back in. Did you just win? Did you just win something? So, in fact, Solomon, known as the wise king, Solomon, son of David, on the Temple Mount, where the king's palace also was, right next to the Temple of Jerusalem, he built a shrine so that his wife, Gentile wife, could worship her little deities. So the son of David, paradigmatic king of Israel, married a Gentile wife, princess, and made her a little pagan shrine right there next to the temple. So this very strict hostility against visible images is something which never seems to permanently stick. For example, if you look at Catholic churches, often they do have visible images, certainly of the Virgin Mary, of Jesus. In fact, if you ever tour the Vatican, you'll find that there are what in Sanskrit would be called murtis, or idols, icons, realistic sculptures of all the popes. In fact, there are actually far more pope statues than there are Jesus statues in the central chamber of the Vatican. But there was, from time to time, especially coming from Middle Eastern traditions, there is an attempt to stomp this out, sometimes literally stomp it out like with your boots. To give an example, I'll give two examples, one from Northern Europe, one from the Middle East. I believe in the 1500s, maybe early 1600s, I can't remember, but during the Protestant Reformation, in the lowlands, Netherlands, Holland, which had been Catholic, but which had a rising Protestant population, they had what they call these iconoclastic furies, where the Protestants would, get very angry at what they thought was this evil idol worship going on in Catholic churches with all their stained glass windows, the sacred art of Bible scenes, and of course Mary, the Virgin Mary, and Jesus, so on and so forth. And so they would break into Catholic churches, mobs, Protestant mobs would break into Catholic churches, smash all the plate glass windows, smash all the statues and so on, and basically destroy anything that had a sacred image on it, an image of some sacred figure. So these were called the iconoclastic furies. And there was a Wahhabi revolution in Islam. Islam at one point was actually quite a cosmopolitan, intellectually sophisticated civilization. With the Renaissance and the rise of Europe and so on, the Middle East was somewhat impoverished, and it's almost comparable to what happened in Germany after World War I, when a country is impoverished and it becomes, and when they have radical problems, they look for radical solutions. So about 200 years ago in Saudi Arabia, there was a Wahhabi revolution where they felt that Islam had become corrupted by, again, going back to visible images and icons and so on. And so they set out to destroy all these, and they took this quote-unquote revolution to the point of desecrating and destroying monuments to Muhammad. At the birthplace of Muhammad, there had been a shrine erected, and they destroyed that, because even to worship Muhammad was idol worship. And so now Islam had become sophisticated in contact with Europe, specifically in contact with Western philosophy, especially Aristotle, back then, about 1,000 years ago. And certainly Christianity in Europe had become as sophisticated theologically, artistically. Renaissance was to a large extent centered on Christian culture. So essentially what you have is, trying to avoid coughing here. Once it starts, hard stop. Essentially, if we look at world civilization, we can say that in Europe and in India, and in civilizations in contact with Europe and India, and even going into the Middle East and other parts of the world, actually, you can say almost everywhere except the Middle East, there was a tendency to recognize that divine power, God, Goddess, can appear in a physical form. And in the Middle East, there was sort of an extreme hostility against this idea. And even in Middle Eastern religions such as Judaism and Islam, there was a tendency again and again to go back to these visible images and then periodic revolutions against it, which were often violent and intolerant and usually resorted to physically desecrating and destroying these physical objects. And so in India, of course, this puja, this worship of visible images, is sort of the center of Hindu worship. And I think I mentioned before, ultimately it gets down to, you could say an ontological dispute. Ontos in Greek means existence. So ontology is the part of philosophy that deals with the nature of existence. As I've mentioned before, the great systematic, comprehensive, categorical, philosophical traditions in the world mainly developed in Europe and in India. The Middle East did not produce an independent, comprehensive, systematic, philosophical tradition, and therefore I think this is related to the fact of their this extreme hostility toward the notion that God or Goddess or some form of divine power can in fact appear within what heretofore or was or what apparently is dead matter. The idea being that if you think back at Vedanta, it's all one. The notion that everything is Brahman. The fact that even matter, like even this plastic bottle, which will probably last up into and even beyond the apocalypse, this non-biodegradable bottle. So that even something like a plastic bottle is ultimately, if you ask the question, okay, it's dead matter, but what is it ultimately? And where does it ultimately come from? And in many philosophical traditions, they concluded ultimately it's actually coming from the absolute truth. It's part of the one ultimate reality, which is intimately connected to, emanates from God. And so, if you think of philosophy, when you think philosophically or even scientifically, there's always a tendency to find broad categories and explain everything. Think of the great effort in physics to find the one great equation that explains all other equations. Grand unified theories, right? GUTS, GUTS. Looking for these great unified theories or unifying theories in philosophy, in science, and so on. And so, ultimately, philosophy, you could say East and West, serious systematic philosophy, led thinkers to look for and to believe they had found, in this way or that way, a oneness, a unity, an ultimate harmony of all that exists. And from that point of view, it's completely natural that the divine will manifest even within matter, because matter is ultimately part of the divine. Matter is ultimately ultimately in perfect harmony with its source, which is the absolute truth. Now, in a part of the world where there was not really much philosophy going around, and there tended to be rather tribalism, and so there was a notion that this is just dead matter, and God is up there, and it's an extreme dualism. God and Creator and the creation are extremely different. They're categorically different. There is no ultimate harmony such that matter can also become a vehicle for the manifestation of God, because matter and God are just, you could say, almost absolutely different. There is no ultimate harmony. There is no ultimate oneness here. And therefore, to say that God appears in matter is evil, because it's saying that God somehow becomes contaminated or, contaminated or limited by appearing in what is intrinsically and irrevocably an evil energy, which is dead matter. This way of looking at things, of course, as we know, led to horrendous ecological consequences. Because when you look at dead matter as somehow intrinsically evil and totally disconnected from God, well, basically it led to the trashing of the earth. It led to a certain, I mean, you could say, historical cruelty toward animals. Because after all, animals are fundamentally excluded. I mean, ultimately, there's only God and those souls who have the right doctrine or dogma. And everyone else, including the entire material universe, all other human beings, animals, birds, everyone is basically just totally bad and deserves no serious moral consideration, and either is tortured forever or just annihilated, and that's the end of it. So nothing has value at all. Nothing has any positive value except God and those relatively few souls in human bodies that adopt the right dogma. And if you think about the nature of tribalism, if you think about the nature of tribal psychology, and I think it's somewhat obvious that, let's say, even if there is a God and there are souls, people who are not enlightened tend to see even God and souls through the filter of their own heavy psychological conditioning. And this is the whole principle of yoga. The more one is free of psychological conditioning, the more one can see objectively. So if you think about the nature of tribal psychology, and you have very much a tribal type sociology going on in the Middle East. In fact, we still do to a large extent. I mean, it hasn't even changed that much. So if you think about tribal psychology, it's basically that our tribe is everything and everybody else is nothing. And that's kind of the end of the story. We are everything and everyone else is nothing. And therefore, in fact, if you look at one of the features of third world culture, and I don't just mean here economically, because there are many third world areas in America, but one of the, from a sociological point of view, one of the prime features is that people only care about their own friends and relatives. It's like, I was talking to a good friend of mine from India over the break. I mean, he lives in America now. And he was mentioning how when he would go to different government offices, he happened to be living in West Bengal, people were just sitting around doing nothing, and if he suggested that maybe they should do their job and actually, take care of him because he had some business to do, they were actually offended. I mean, they took it as an offense. And so you find this culture, wherever there's this type of corruption, not only this country, that country, anywhere, it's like if you're my friend or family, I'll bend all the rules. There are no rules. You don't have to pay the fee. I'll give you whatever you want. And if you're not my friend or family, even if you follow the rules, I won't give you anything. If you bribe me, I'll think about it. And so if you think about this tribal psychology, this sort of low tribal psychology, where you and your friends and family are everything and the rest of the world is nothing, and then apply that and imagine looking at religion through this psychological filter, it turns out that people that belong to our sub-branch of a religion, people that belong to our specific sect or denomination or whatever it is, and who precisely accept our dogma, will get everything, and the entire rest of creation gets nothing, or at least nothing positive. They may get a lot of negative stuff thrown at them, but nothing positive. And so if we contrast this, I think, scary way of looking at reality, and if you look at those traditions, and there are many traditions, not only in India, that developed a more philosophical view, and again, the grand unified theory, the ultimate equation is that, in a sense, Atman is Brahman, that everything is somehow part of that absolute truth, and so everything is included, and nothing is excluded. So whether a soul happens to be in the body of an animal, or a reptile, or an insect, or a human being, it doesn't matter, because there's an ultimate oneness in every soul. Every life ultimately is valuable and important. And similarly, matter, dead matter, may not be the highest energy of God, being dead matter, However, it's still ultimately divine. It's inseparably connected to God, and so the entire universe is somehow sacred, as opposed to the tribal view that our little community is sacred and everyone else is worthless or condemned. So what I'm trying to say is that the idol worship, because it's such a prominent feature of Hinduism, and it was such a prominent feature of pagan culture before it was brutally, violently exterminated in Europe for the most part by the Middle Eastern religion, which gained the favor of the Roman Emperor. The notion, Paul, in the New Testament, Paul gives an argument against the worship of visible images. I'm not saying you should run out and start worshiping visible images. I'm simply trying to level the playing field and show that these are the different ways you could look at it. So Paul, for example, gives the argument, I don't know if I mentioned this in an earlier class, that because he was always preaching to people who were worshiping idols, and always trying to convince them that they were engaged in a false religion, worshiping a dead god or goddess. So Paul's argument was that typically, in order to worship your little figurines or icons or whatever, you offer food or clothes, or the typical thing you find all over the world, where you sort of treat the deity as a real person and offer all the amenities that a normal person would want, such as clothes, food, even a place to sleep at night, a little shrine, and so on. You find this also in Buddhism. Buddhism got big time into this, by the way. Basically, it was all around the world. So Paul said that if you are really worshiping God, God doesn't need your food, God doesn't need your clothes. So why are you doing this if it's really God? The obvious answer to Paul, which was not recorded in the New Testament, but the obvious answer was, okay, Paul, if God can feed himself, he can also explain himself. So who needs you to go around and explain God? God can explain himself as well as he can feed himself. So the idea of serving a deity, God or goddess, whatever, is that for the worshipper's own purification. So not that God or goddess would need food, but that we need to learn gratitude and we need to learn humility. So that was generally the philosophy. Now it also should be noted that in this worship of gods and goddesses, or icons, visible images, that there was a wide range, because some people, very materialistic, simply worship for material gains. And then some people worshipped out of pure love. Some people were monotheistic, some people were polytheistic. And so you have the general belief that divine power can manifest these visible images. And again, there were polytheists, there were monotheists, there were people who were very materialistic, people who worshipped with selfless devotion. And you can find this even in other religions. If you look at Christianity or Judaism or Islam or any religion, you can find people who worshipped with a very crass attitude, just getting material things, like, I want this material thing. I want a new car, I want a house, I want this, I want that, so I'm going to worship God. And they prayed for it. You can see this Sunday morning on TV, actually. So, and then also within all these religions, there are people who were, you could say, selflessly devoted. You can look in the Sufi tradition of Islam, the Christian mystical traditions, even bridal mysticism, seeing God as one's lover. And so in all these different religions, there's a whole range of motivations. And so the same thing with these visible images. Some people worship out of love, some people worship out of the most crass materialism, just to get just whatever they wanted. Another thing is that, so what did the worship, what does it, still goes on, what does it actually consist of? It's often been compared to a guest reception, in the sense that you invoke the deity. You have a visible form. The distinction is actually made. I'm going to give the more philosophically aware traditions, not just the sort of superstitious thing that goes on among people who aren't really concerned at all with philosophy. Among those who actually thought about these things, let's say you carve a deity. Let's say you carved a deity of Rama, to give a typical example, of Rama, the Lord Rama from the Ramayana. If you carved a deity, Sitaram, typically, Sitaram, the understanding is there that this marble is not God. This marble is not God. It's simply carved marble. Now, if you want God to actually be present in that image, there's a whole process, an invocation, where you chant certain prayers, certain sacred hymns, and you pray, and you make offerings, and you invite Rama, who ultimately is not a material being. You invite Rama to come into that form and to somehow be manifest within that form. And so the distinction is made between the physical, say the marble, or the metal, or the wood. The distinction is made between that form itself and God, who is not material, but who agrees to come within that form. I mean, think of the burning bush of the Old Testament. I mean, a bush is not God, and fire in a bush is not God. But somehow the idea was that God became present in that burning bush, and therefore it became the vehicle for an epiphany. So anyway, I don't have to say too much more, I think, about it. As far as, well, finally, actually there are a few more things I wanted to say about puja, and that is that in the more sophisticated versions of this, say like in the Bhagavad Purana, which is one of the most sophisticated spiritual works in India, there's a recognition that if you worship God in that deity form and neglect other human beings, then your worship is not acceptable. This is really right on the money if you look at the Jesus tradition. The point of Jesus that you cannot get to God simply by performing following all kinds of laws and rules and this or that worship if you mistreat other people. Because the two great commandments are love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. So similarly, I'll read you just two verses from the Bhagavatam which hit upon this very much, I think, in the spirit of a lot of the teachings attributed to Jesus, although within an Indian context. One statement, this is from the third canto of the Bhagavatam, this is God speaking, Krishna. Aham ucha vachaya dravyai kriyotpanna yanage naiva tusher chitor chayam bhutagrama avamanina. What this means is that, in English, translated for you, that where Krishna or God is saying that I am not satisfied by all the varieties of worship, or by worship in which one offers all kinds of material things. All the different material objects that you could offer in worship. And Krishna is saying, I'm not satisfied by that kind of worship. If the worship is coming from someone who disrespects other creatures. In Sanskrit there is Bhukta Brahma. In other words, if you disrespect other creatures, and not just human beings, the only difference in this worldview between a human being and an animal is that the body is different, the covering is different, the soul inside is exactly the same soul. For example, if you compare the intelligence or the ability, the competence of an experienced adult human being and an infant, the infant is actually far less intelligent, far less capable than an animal, and yet we generally don't allow infanticide. So, again, one who disrespects other creatures in general cannot satisfy God, even if they offer the most opulent, elaborate worship to the icon. You got a point?
What verse is this?
3:29-24. And then another statement from the 11th and ultimate canto of the Bhagavatam is Archayami Vahariye Pujang Jakshadayehate Latat Bhakteshu Janyeshu Savaktas Prakritas Mrita. This means that a person who, with faith, just threw out the first cough. A person who, with faith, performs worship, puja, performs worship to the Lord, but that person does not offer the same worship to the same Lord who lives in the hearts of all creatures, then that devotee is said to be on the material platform. That person is not a spiritualist. That person is not actually engaged spiritually. The idea being here that when you go into a temple, say a Hindu mandir, and there's a deity, whether it's Sita Ram or Radha Krishna, Shiva or whatever, that same deity, this is the idea, the deity or the divinity, God, is present in that archa, that visible form or murti. But that same God, well, how should I put it? The idea is that every living body in any species of life is also a temple. Because since God is in the heart of every creature, this is the idea, since God is in the heart of every creature, every living body is a temple. And so if a worshiper does not recognize that same God in every living body, so that every living thing is worthy of honor and respect, then one's understanding, one's worship is said to be material and not spiritual. So this is a very strong statement, that every living body is a temple, and not merely the temple, the temple, official temple. And you have to recognize this in order to be considered a spiritual practitioner. So, any questions on that? If not, we can get to the sort of X-rated part of the class. We're going to speak about Tantra. If anyone here is under 13, you have to get your parents' permission. So there was, we're going to talk about Tantra now. So a few minutes. The word Tantra comes from a Sanskrit root, tan, which means to expand or stretch. And the suffix tra in Sanskrit indicates instrumentality or the means of carrying something out. And so Tantra literally means the means of expanding. The idea is that you have the Vedas, which mostly talk about fire sacrifice and rituals like that. But there's a whole body, a huge amount of Tantra literature, which expands. For example, instead of simply performing yajna or fire sacrifice, you can perform puja. You can build temples. The Tantra also provides additional information about the nature of God, the nature of the spiritual world, the nature of how God appears in the world, and so on. Now, if you look at the Puranas, say, like the Bhagavad Purana, and basically the Puranas in general, or even Mahabharata, they're actually a combination of two different, they have material from two different sources, which in the Puranas would be called Vaidika and Tantrika. Vedic, which refers back to the original four Vedas, the Brahman literature, Aranyakas, Upanishads, and so on and so forth. But then in India, you had all this claim that there was additional revelation. That's called Tantrika, which simply means tantric. And so a lot of modern Hinduism cannot be traced directly to the original four Vedas and the commentarial literature on the four Vedas, but it comes to these Tantra literatures. And so the Puranas and Itihasa, the histories, Mahabharata, Ramayana, incorporate a lot of this ancient material. Now, that's sort of the force, but there's a dark side of the force. This is the oldest Tantra, and the part which is, so to speak, respectable, decent. It involves a lifestyle which we would normally associate with spirituality in the sense of giving up selfishness, giving up gross attempts to exploit one's body or other people's bodies. So this is the Tantra. However, in India there arose another kind of Tantra, which basically these tantrics were sort of the original Hindu hippies, you might say. As I think I told you, I'm from California, so I went to Berkeley, went to school at Berkeley in the second half of the 60s, and the hippie thing was like, well, it was the full flowering. I saw a shirt actually today on campus. What did it say? Pick flowers, not fights. Anyway, so back, that was the original make love, not war thing. So, but there was among a lot of some of the hippies, there was sort of if unstated, but there was an implicit philosophy, which was that life is meant for freedom, because liberation. The word salvation, in a sense, in Sanskrit is often moksha, which literally means liberation, to be free. So life is meant for freedom, and ultimately, to be totally free, you even have to become free of rules and regulations, such as rules against incest or rules against intoxication. And so basically, these, anyway, imagine a bunch of tantrics there. These people came up with, they saw sexual energy as something not to be transcended, but as something to be channeled. So they wanted to arouse sexual energy and then channel it into mystic practices. They came up with the, just like we have a corporation in America called the 3M Corporation. So there was the 5M thing in India. They call it the Pancha. Pancha means 5. Whoops. I think cold has gone to my head. Let's see. Pancha means 5, like in Pentagon. The Pancha Makara. Makara here just means the letter M, so the 5 M's. And these were, let's see, Mituna and Mangsa, Mada and Mudra. Who's fifth one? Oh, Machi. So there's these pancha, these 5 M's that you perform in order to practice Tantra, where Machi just means fish. These are all the things that were forbidden by high-class Brahminical culture. You should eat fish. Mangsa means meat. Mada, liquor. Mudra, hand signs. I don't know what kind of obscene hand gestures they did back then, but there were certain kind of hand gestures. And Mitra means sex. So now there was sort of a really hardcore Tantra group where the more outrageous your act, the more free you were. So you shouldn't simply break sexual taboos, but you should actually have the most forbidden kind of sex possible, incest. And even say within incest, like go for the really gnarliest of all. So without going into all the gory details, this group of people who, of course, shocked and scandalized Brahminical society, and Buddhists. There was a very prominent Buddhist Tantra. By this time, Buddhism had become quite a bit Hinduized. They got into their Tantra, and there were different kinds of sexual rituals where you sort of, you just almost just do it, but conserve the energy. And any questions about that? There'll be no in-class demonstrations. Yes.
You said Mangsa and Mata were?
Mangsa is meat. And what was the other one? Mada is liquor. Hand gesture. That's kind of that one's hard to figure. I guess there's some kinds of secret or obscene hand gestures. Like if you were, someone cut you off when you were in your horse cart or something, I guess you could give them a mudra. Now, part of this Tantra understanding, again, there was some really nasty, hardcore Tantra, but then some of it was simply, some of it became what was acceptable to rabbinical culture, such as the idea that ultimately the absolute truth has male and female components. So if you think of Radha Krishna or Sita Ram, the idea that a full manifestation of the absolute truth includes both the male and the female. A few things from the book. Tantra homologizes, in other words, sort of analogizes, the human body to the cosmos. Here it said that it's antinomian. The And what's interesting here is that although in India they have their own version of it, but it's something which you find everywhere. The Greek word nomos means law. And so antinomian means that you seek freedom by breaking all the rules. That you, and that's what you consider to be freedom. The argument against this would be that the rules, following the rules, actually makes you free. For example, let's say you're sick, and so you're given certain rules to follow, like take this medicine, or don't eat that food, or rest, or whatever. It's precisely by following the rules that you actually you get cured of your disease, and then you're free because you're healthy. Or let's say if you're driving your car on the road, to be free means to be free to get where you want to go. And if you actually stay on the road and drive carefully, you'll get to your destination safely, and that's real freedom. Or for example, let's say you're playing a musical instrument, and you take the time to really master it, in the sense of, well, not only developing physical dexterity, but also mastering harmony, mastering musicology, and so on. And then by actually putting your time in, you get to the point where you can express any feeling that you have, no matter how subtle. You can actually express it musically. If you ever played a musical instrument, you know that if you're not really good enough, sometimes you'll kind of have melodies in your head, or you'll have a certain feeling you want to express, but you just don't have the technique to express it. Or in the same way, learning language. I mean, the more one masters language, the more precisely one can express oneself. So freedom comes through mastery, which comes through practice, which always involves following rules. And so most people would give the example and argue that it's precisely by following appropriate rules that one develops true mastery, and with true mastery comes real freedom. So this Tantra gradually, things that are that radical tend never to last that long. It sort of got reassimilated, sublimated, sanitized, and moderated within Hindu tradition. No questions on that? Yes? Just stretching? Okay. Well, it wasn't an interrogative stretch. One last thing perhaps I could mention, that it's always mentioned that in Hinduism, worship focused on Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti, the goddess. And there's a sense in which the Vaishnavism, the worship of Vishnu in different forms, such as Krishna or Ram or Vishnu, Narayan, was, first of all, it had the most adherents. It produced, in a sense, the most influential culture. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are both, you could say, Vaishnava works. So the great epics of India are Vaishnava works. The Puranas, the most influential Puranas, such as the Bhagavad Purana, is Vaishnava work. There's evidence that the first great temples were built to Vishnu and so on. Even going back to the earliest commentary on the oldest Vedic literature, Rig Veda, the earliest commentary, the Aitareya Brahmana, says in the first verse that of all the gods, the highest is Vishnu. So typically, Shiva was seen as the destructive power of God. Not that he himself is bad, but that that was his function, to destroy the cosmos. Brahma was a creator, Vishnu was a preserver. So Vishnu is always associated with goodness, with preservation. And so also in the Vaishnava side, you have the idea that the personal God is eternal. That even when you become enlightened, even when you achieve perfection on your path, you ultimately go to a spiritual world where you are with a personal God, a fully personal God. Whereas often in the Shaiva traditions, in the Shakta traditions, you would begin by worshiping a personal God, but at the end it would merge into something else. You would merge into some type of corporate radiance, some type of oneness. You would give up your person. And Shiva himself, for example, his typical form, dressed in a certain way and holding a trident and so on and so forth. That visible form of Shiva ultimately vanishes and turns out not to be the real Shiva. The real Shiva is something more impersonal. So the Vaishnava side, in a sense, was the great theistic tradition of India, and that taught that ultimately God is personal and doesn't simply vanish into something impersonal at a certain stage of advancement along the path. That was one last point. Any question on any of that stuff? No? I guess you sort of got your money's worth. Yes, back there.
What was the name of that tradition with the sexually, more sexually explicit acts?
For the Tantra?
That's just Tantra?
Well, there are many forms of Tantra, and that was one of the more scandalous forms.
Well, how are these people received in society?
Well, often they did their stuff like secretly. For example, there are people that live in very nice middle-class houses and water their lawn, but at night they have wife-swapping parties and things, but generally don't advertise it to all their neighbors. So it was one of those things that it was somewhat clandestine and eventually kind of got repressed. I mean, when the Muslims invaded India, and soon, we talk about the Islamic invasion, they thought this stuff confirmed all their worst fears about pagan religion, and they tend to just like destroy it, kill people, and so on.
I heard Tantra referred to as like black or white magic or something in the sex or something. Is that true?
Well, there was definitely a dark side of the Force tradition. In fact, it was called in Sanskrit Vama, the Vama marg, the left. I mean, if you think like in English, there's a word, something that's kind of really awkward or out of place. You could say it's very gauche, like that was really gauche. But the word gauche, G-A-U-C-H-E, actually just means left in French as opposed to right. And so left tend to mean like weird. And so this is called the Vama marg, of the left path. So I guess we'll stop here.